It begins with a sound. Not a scream, not a cry for help, not even the shuffling feet of a restless patient down a long, sterile hall. It is a much quieter, more intimate sound. It is the sound of a sharp metal instrument being gently placed against the top of the eye socket just beneath the eyelid. And then it is followed by another sound, the dull, percussive tap, tap, tap of a surgical mallet. A sound that is small, yet carries the weight of a life being irrevocably, brutally changed. This was not the sound of an attack. This was the sound of a cure. At least, that is what its creator, a celebrated and ambitious doctor, called it. It was the sound of the transorbital lobotomy, a procedure hailed as a miracle, a surgical key to unlock the tormented mind. A procedure that won its inventor a Nobel Prize and was performed on tens of thousands of people across the world. But for the men, women, and even children who heard those taps from the inside, it was the sound of their soul being broken. It was the beginning of a living nightmare, a brutal reality from which many would never truly awaken. Welcome back to Morbid Medicine, the channel that listens to the darkest whispers of medical history. Today, we explore the brutal reality of being lobotomized. This is a story of desperation, medical hubris, and the catastrophic attempt to cure the mind by destroying the self. To understand how such a horrifying procedure could ever have been considered a solution, we must first understand the problem. We must transport ourselves back to the early 20th century and listen to the sounds of the great asylums. These institutions, often built with good intentions, had become something else entirely. They were filled with a cacophony of human suffering, the distant wails of the deeply distressed, the manic shouts of the agitated, the unsettling silence of the catatonic. These asylums were overwhelmed and underfunded, warehouses for the mentally ill. Patients suffering from severe schizophrenia, debilitating depression, bipolar disorder, and profound anxiety were all housed together. The so-called treatments were often just as terrifying as the illnesses themselves. There was the shock of being submerged in ice-cold baths for hours, the hiss of high-pressure water hoses used in hydrotherapy, the rasp of canvas straitjackets pulled tight, and the jangling of keys that signaled another day of hopeless confinement. For the most severe cases, there was no hope of release. The medical community was desperate for a way to quiet these sounds, to ease the immense suffering, and to manage the unmanageable. It was in this climate of profound desperation that a Portuguese neurologist named Antonio Egas Moniz believed he had found an answer. Moniz was a respected, ambitious physician. In the 1930s, he learned of experiments performed on two chimpanzees, Becky and Lucy. The chimps were prone to fits of rage, especially when they failed at tasks. After surgeons performed a procedure to sever connections in their frontal lobes, their dispositions changed entirely. They became calm, placid, and untroubled by their failures. A powerful idea took root in Moniz's mind. He theorized that the recurring, obsessive thoughts of the mentally ill were trapped in fixed neural pathways in the frontal lobes. If he could just cut those pathways, he reasoned, he could set the patient free. He famously argued that severing these connections would diminish the psychic disturbances in humans. He called his new procedure a leucotomy, from the Greek for white cut, because it targeted the brain's white matter. In November of 1935, the first procedure was performed. Moniz instructed his colleague to drill 2 holes into the skull of a former asylum patient. They then destroyed the frontal lobe tissue with injections of pure alcohol. They soon developed a more refined instrument for the task, the leucotome. It was a long, thin tube with a retractable wire loop at its end. This device would be inserted into the brain, and the wire loop would be extended and rotated, scrambling the delicate tissue and coring out sections of the frontal lobe. Moniz claimed remarkable success rates. Out of his first group of patients, he reported that a significant number were cured or improved. To a world desperate for good news from the front lines of mental health, this sounded like a miracle. The leucotomy began to gain international acclaim, but even Moniz admitted the procedure had a disturbing effect. He noted it could result in a psychic mutilation and a blunting of the personality. Patients became apathetic, their emotional lives flattened. They were quieter, yes, but something fundamental had been taken from them. The man who would take this flawed procedure and launch it into a full-blown medical crusade was an American neurologist named Dr. Walter Jackson Freeman, II. Freeman was not a quiet researcher. He was a relentless promoter, a showman with an almost religious faith in the power of the lobotomy. He saw it as his personal mission to bring this cure to the masses and empty the nation's crowded asylums. Freeman, working with his neurosurgeon partner James Watts, initially performed the standard leucotomy. It was a proper surgical procedure, requiring an operating room, a surgeon, and the time-consuming process of drilling through the skull. This was too slow for Freeman's grand ambitions. He envisioned performing thousands, even tens of thousands of lobotomies. He needed a method that was faster, cheaper, and more accessible. His dark inspiration came from anatomy. He knew that the thickest parts of the skull were a major obstacle, but he also knew that the plate of bone behind the eye sockets was perilously thin. He theorized he could access the frontal lobes directly through this route. He had found his shortcut to the brain. This was the genesis of the transorbital lobotomy, a procedure so crude it defies belief. Walter Freeman had devised a surgery he could perform in just 10 minutes, not in a sterile operating room, but in a psychiatric ward, a hospital back room, or even in his own office. Let's be clear about what this procedure entailed, stripped of any visual distractions. A patient would be rendered unconscious, typically through electroshock. After the violent convulsions ceased, Freeman would begin. He would lift the patient's eyelid and insert a long, sharp instrument called an orbitoclast, his custom-designed version of an ice pick, into the corner of the eye socket. He would then take a surgical mallet and tap the end of the instrument. Those present in the room would hear a sickening, crunching sound as the point of the orbitoclast broke through the thin orbital plate and entered the brain. Once inside the prefrontal cortex, he would then swing the instrument back and forth in a wide arc, severing the neural connections. Then, for a deeper, more aggressive cut, he would reposition the instrument and plunge it further into the brain. The entire process was then repeated on the other side of the head. The ordeal was over in minutes. Freeman became a traveling evangelist for his procedure. He drove across the United States in a van he called the Lobotomobile, demonstrating his technique and performing thousands of lobotomies. He was known for his theatrical flair and his chilling lack of concern. Witnesses reported his flippant attitude when things went wrong. If a patient died on the table due to a slip of the instrument, he was known to show little remorse, simply moving on to the next scheduled procedure. Freeman saw himself as a healer, a liberator. His standard for success, however, was not a return to a full and healthy life. A successful lobotomy, in his view, was one that resulted in a patient who could be discharged from an asylum. A patient rendered docile, emotionally blank, and easy to manage was a successful outcome, because they were no longer a problem for their family or for the state. But the internal reality for the person who underwent the procedure was a different matter entirely. To truly understand the brutal reality, we must listen to the stories of the silenced. The most famous case is that of Rosemary Kennedy, the sister of President John F. Kennedy. Rosemary was not suffering from a severe psychosis. She was intellectually delayed and, as a young woman, was prone to emotional outbursts and rebellion. Her father, Joseph P. Kennedy, a man driven by political ambition and a desire for public perfection, saw his daughter's difficulties as a liability. He was convinced by Walter Freeman that a lobotomy would calm her moods and make her more manageable. In 1941, at the age of 23, Rosemary underwent the procedure. It was a surgical lobotomy, and she was kept awake throughout. The surgeons instructed her to recite prayers and tell them stories. They continued cutting until her words became slurred and then stopped altogether. The result was an absolute catastrophe. The procedure did not just modify her behavior, it extinguished her. Rosemary was left with the mental capacity of a young child. She lost the ability to speak coherently, she became incontinent, and she would spend hours with a profound emotional blankness. For the rest of her long life, she was institutionalized, her condition a carefully guarded family secret. In an effort to solve a problem of social convenience, her father had authorized the destruction of her mind. The outcomes for the thousands of other lobotomy patients varied, but they were almost universally tragic. A significant number died from the procedure itself. Many more were left with severe physical disabilities, including epilepsy. But the most common result was what one could call a soul death. The frontal lobes are the source of our personality, our judgment, our creativity, our ability to form complex thoughts and feel deep emotions. The lobotomy was a blunt force trauma to the very core of the self. Patients who were once described as vibrant, artistic, or passionate, albeit troubled, were left apathetic and inert. They lost their initiative, their curiosity, their capacity for joy and for sorrow. The wards became quieter, but it was the quiet of profound emptiness. The brutal reality of the lobotomy was that it often replaced mental anguish with a void. One of the most essential accounts comes from Howard Doley, who was lobotomized by Walter Freeman in 1960 at the age of just 12. Doley wasn't psychotic. He was a difficult, energetic child, and his stepmother sought Freeman's help. After the procedure, Doley spent his life feeling like a stranger to himself. He drifted through life with a sense of profound detachment, a feeling that something essential had been scraped out of him. Decades later, he investigated his own past and uncovered Freeman's chillingly casual notes on his case. His memoir, My Lobotomy, is a powerful testimony to the internal experience of being lobotomized. He wrote of feeling like a zombie, of having no sense of self, of living a life that didn't feel like his own. He gives a voice to the internal silence that the procedure created in so many. The question remains, how did this medical horror persist for so long? For nearly 2 decades, the lobotomy was celebrated. An estimated 50,000 procedures were performed in the United States alone. In a decision that remains shocking to this day, Antonio Egas Moniz was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1949 for his work. The convenient promise of a cure drowned out the whispers of the brutal reality. The end of the lobotomy era came not from a moral awakening, but from a chemical one. In the early 1950s, a new drug called chlorpromazine, later marketed as thorazine, was introduced. It was the first truly effective antipsychotic medication. Thorazine could calm agitation and reduce the symptoms of psychosis without physically destroying the brain. It became known as the chemical lobotomy. While it was far from a perfect solution and had its own severe side effects, it offered a less permanent, less brutal alternative. The rise of thorazine made the ispic lobotomy seem not only barbaric but obsolete. The quiet criticism that had been growing for years finally found its voice. The Soviet Union had already banned the procedure in 1950, condemning it as inhumane. As the devastating long-term effects on patients became impossible to ignore, the medical community and the public finally turned against the practice. Walter Freeman, the procedure's greatest champion, was eventually disgraced, though he never wavered in his belief that his work had been a gift to humanity. The story of the lobotomy is one of the most sobering in the archives of medicine. It is a terrifying cautionary tale about the dangers of medical hubris and the desperate hunt for a miracle cure. It reveals how easily the desire to alleviate suffering can curdle into a brutal form of social control, a way to make people who are different, difficult, or inconvenient simply disappear by erasing their personalities. The brutal reality of being lobotomized was the reality of having your selfhood surgically stolen. It was the replacement of a complex, feeling human being with a quiet, manageable shell. The silence it produced was not the sound of peace, but the sound of absence. It stands as a permanent, chilling reminder that in the delicate territory of the human mind, the line between healing and destroying can be perilously, terrifyingly thin. Thank you for joining us for this exploration of one of medicine's darkest chapters. If you believe that we must understand the mistakes of the past to protect the future, please subscribe to Morbid Medicine for more stories from the history of our fight to heal. Until next time, stay curious and be grateful for how far we have come.